You can take it away.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Collaboratively Pursuing Policy Solutions, Lessons Learned from the USBC. My name is Cheryl Lebedevich, and I'm the Senior Policy and Communications Manager here at the USBC, and I'm so glad you've joined us for today's session. This educational activity has been verified for 1.5 CDR CPE units and 1.5 LSERP credits. So at the end of the webinar, we will share with you how to request your continuing education credit. This webinar has been made possible through funding from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. Neither the CDC nor any of its components operate, control, or are responsible for or necessarily endorse the content of this webinar. Live transcription has been enabled for today's session. Just go to live transcript in your Zoom doc to turn it on and choose CC live transcript. As a reminder, the transcript is auto-generated and may contain some errors. During the presentation, participants will be in a listen-only mode. Despite the virtual format of the session, though, we do hope that it will be as interactive as possible. So please do share your insights and questions throughout the presentation using the Q&A feature located in your Zoom doc. If you're having any audio issues through your computer's microphone or speakers, please try just dialing in for audio connection. And if those challenges persist, you can email us at office@usbreastfeeding.org, and one of our staff members will do their best to troubleshoot with you. As a reminder, this session is being recorded, and it will be accessible to all webinar registrants within 1 week of the live session. And the slides for today's session have been uploaded to the chat box, so please stay tuned for those. Webinar is part of USBC's ongoing capacity building services designed to build the field's readiness, power, and efficiency in advancing policy systems and environmental changes that make breastfeeding and human milk feeding a viable option for families. Today's presentation will introduce key components of the collective impact model, offer strategies for building trust across groups of difference, and highlight a few tools for collaborative change. I'll be joined today by USBC's Deputy Director, Amelia Pasmythe-Seeger. Amelia has served as the Deputy Director of the U.S. Breastfeeding Committee since 2012, after prior leadership roles in local and state coalitions. She is a skilled facilitator and experienced advocate who centers the growth of trust and relationships and shared learning to support the USBC's collaborative constellation work groups to achieve large-scale policy systems and environmental change. She's a certified equity-informed mediator, coach, and systemic constellation facilitator. And I will invite Amelia to share your slides. There we are again. So we wanted to start this webinar by sharing a glorious win that we've had in just the last couple of weeks. So this is not a webinar where we're going to be diving deep, but we did want to take a moment as part of this policy webinar to talk about one of the big differences that we're seeing in the landscape of lactation support in our nation, which is the passage of the Pump for Nursing Mothers Act. So I cry every time I talk about it, but the Pump for Nursing Mothers Act has been is a new legislation signed into law December 29th, and it expanded the right to break time and a private space to pump during the workday to millions more families. So we're absolutely thrilled. It also provides a private right of action so that in the event that an employer does not comply with the law, that lactating worker has the opportunity for some recourse and some monetary remedies. So this is a big change in the landscape, and we're very grateful to everyone who has helped get us there. Do stay tuned. There are going to be many resources that you're going to see and opportunities to really hear more about what this means for families and how we can, as a field, really do our best to support families in understanding their legal protections. So stay tuned in the Weekly Wire for written resources as well as webinar opportunities. So with that, I will pass on to Amelia.
All right, thank you so much, Cheryl. Yeah, every time I hear you say it, my heart expands along with it. Really major milestone. So as Cheryl said, there's going to be so many ongoing conversations and work because passing a law is only the first step. So the implementation is to come. But today, we're really going to focus on policy systems and environmental change, how it is that we do that, not only at USBC on the national level, but really through grassroots mobilization and at any layer of scale. Right? What we're talking about is recognizing that no one is an island, right? We don't exist here all by ourselves, right? We're actually informed by, influenced by, and at times constrained by many layers of influences all around us, right? So we can think about those layers, right? We've got our family and cultural lenses, right? And what we really mean by that is both tradition and comfort, right? And I don't think there's any of us who have been immune to the weight of a sentence like, that's not how women in our family do it. Right? So when you hear that, when you feel that, when you take that on, that becomes both an influence, sometimes a constraint, particularly if you're someone who wants to do things in a new way. Then we have a layer of healthcare practices, and we know that access to care is not equal in our country, even neighborhood to neighborhood. In our communities, we're influenced by what's normal and typical, what's around us. But again, the resources that are there right there in our immediate environment. When we talk about workplace support, even with this law that just got passed, we're still talking about time and money. That private right of action is going to require means in order to access support, and the breaks are still unpaid. Right, which takes us to the realm of law and policies. What we're really talking about is how does fairness and justice work in our society? And surrounding all of that is media and marketing, right? The surround of the messages that are around us. And right now, that's not only influence, but influencers. So we're up kind of, in a milieu that contains a lot. So all those contexts are further layered within systems, right? Our real life experiences are defined by intangibles like policies and environments. We know that in the Healthy People 2030 goals, we see that the social determinants of health include naming some of these contexts, right? The social and community context, the neighborhood and built environment, economic stability, education access and quality, and healthcare access and quality. We're going to be measuring that as we move towards the Healthy People 2030 goals. So why is it that at USBC we focus on policy and systems, right? It's because breastfeeding, initiation, and duration are a measure of equity and community health, right? Because achieving one's breastfeeding goals is not solely up to the individual or their will or capacity. Breastfeeding rates indicate larger systemic health and how much support or resource is available. So we work here on policy and systems. So although it can sound abstract, feel abstract, it actually changes our lives. So at USBC, we work through collaborative groups that we call constellations to hold this work. Each constellation focuses on a specific topic. We gather together organizations interested in that topic to then explore together what to work on and how to proceed. So our topic is breastfeeding, but the ultimate version of our ultimate vision is liberation, right? So we are here to serve and uplift the people who are most impacted by inequitable policies and structures. So some of what we're going to unpack across this hour is looking at how we do that, right? We take care for who's at the table. We co-create intentional dynamics for the group. We guide shared learning journeys, and we conduct root cause analyses. And the priority strategies that are selected by the group happen by the stakeholders at the table, not the funder, and not USBC as the convener. It's a really, really powerful way that this model distributes leadership and shares the power and decision-making potential. So this is our collaborative approach to collective work and cumulative impact. Now, you've been hearing us for years talk about collective impact. And I think, and I'm sure I'm not the only one who thinks this, that sometimes we've gotten really hung up on the language about it, the words and the labels for it, and have sometimes failed, I think, to really make this live and move and breathe for people. So we're trying to take a new approach in how we're sharing this today. And one thing that I just want to name for those who have been around here for a little while, there was a change in like the underlying research and articulation of this modality of collective impact. In 2011, we talked about the 5 conditions for collective impact as continuous communication, shared measurement, mutually reinforcing activities, common agenda, and backbone. Again, I don't want to belabor this, but our strategic framework at USBC uses this language because that's when we made it. That strategic framework has a 10-year life cycle, and it's time to start rewiring it. And so in the interim period, Tamarack Institute from Canada published Collective Impact 3.0 that actually really reflects much better the ethos of USBC and what has evolved for us over this decade. So this presentation and your learning objectives related to collective impact principles really follows 3.0. So inclusive community engagement, strategic learning, high leverage activities, community aspiration, and containers for change. So we'll look at these one at a time. So at its heart, right, if we want to change entire systems, all those layers, all those contexts that we talked about, it's going to take many people. So we want to have a really inclusive gesture towards the community engagement. So the first step, right, is to bring stakeholders together. That's true whether you're, a small community initiative or a national initiative, right? So we want to recognize right from the start that effectively bringing people together requires a head, hearts, and hands approach. Right? We have to really be engaging all of ourselves, all of our awareness, to be making authentic contact with other people in order to work effectively together. So we need to establish an intentionally inclusive culture. So diversity, equity, and inclusion, I think, is common in our language for most of us. But really the point is that sense of belonging and liberation, right? Because as Dr. Mama Kimmery Bug taught us to say many years ago when the Crash Committee first started working on this at USBC, who is at the table changes the conversation. So we want to be intentional in how we co-create our group agreements. It is okay to start really minimalist. In fact, that might be the best way. You can build over time as you see what's needed. We recommend that you start right from the beginning with both conduct and values. So what do I mean by that? Conduct is what are we doing together? So a procedural type of thing, such as we will wait for everyone to speak a first time before someone speaking a second time. Right? An example of a value is we will center those most impacted, saying we're really going to look at how does this given policy or structure, how is it experienced differently for different communities? And we're going to really focus in on where there's a harm. And then we recommend checking in every meeting and getting buy-in, right? The affirmative stance. These are the group agreements. Is there anything missing? For this meeting, can we agree to this? So that you've built kind of an intentional container for whatever the business is of the day. So it's important, I feel, to then say, there's an element of this that then brings up opportunities for personal growth, right? Another glorious opportunity for personal growth. Life is full of them, right? Now, what does that have to do with collective change? So in the lactation support provider constellation, one of my favorite group agreements, our affirmations is, do not be afraid to be transformed by that which is difficult. Which is really moving to me, right? Because I think there's this larger ethos, right? That everyone wants to transform, but nobody wants to change. Allowing change in the service of a greater transformation means allowing something to shift within your inner system. Why is that important? Right? When we can build the capacity to go deep with one another, right, we then level up the capacity to navigate difference. Right? My mentor, John Carter, says that's the most pressing need of our time. It's true, not all topics require depth. Sometimes when I speak to this, people have said like, wow, Amelia made collective impact sound really heavy, right? Not all topics are like this, but if we're speaking courageously and we're working on topics that impact communities, we may need sometimes to go deep, and we want to be intentionally prepared for that as individuals and as communities of practice coming together towards collaborative work. It's also really important we've learned to move at the speed of trust, right? So John Carter taught me, what are 2 signs of trust in a group, right? We think that it's really ephemeral. And one thing he taught me is if you reach for trust or you name trust, trust slips away, right? Trust is a slippery fish. But how can you know that trust is present in a group? One way is you start to see people have the capacity to give the benefit of the doubt and ask for more information. In what way is that different? In what way is that skill important? Right? If someone does something or says something and it triggers or evokes a reaction in me, if I can pause, remember their humanity, grab hold of my own, right? And say, I wonder what you meant by that. And then ask the question, could you explain your thinking? Which happens, by the way, to be another LSP constellation value, right? We explain our thinking, bring each other along for the ride. It gives the opportunity to not be reactive, but instead to be interactive and to continue to learn from one another. John Carter says another sign of trust in the group is that anyone in the group has comfort voicing an unpopular or dissenting view. It takes a lot of courage to go against the grain. It can threaten our fundamental sense of belonging. And yet if we've done a good job in making it so everyone knows they are welcome, they belong, they're wanted, their voice is needed. If they've got a different perspective, as hard as that can be to voice and as hard as that can be to receive or hear, it's fundamental and often brings up something that might have been missing. So we're going to pause throughout this presentation for reflections. So related to inclusive community engagement, which is the first condition that we're talking about, take a moment and just notice, sit with, what was evoked or provoked for you in what we said? Was there something you heard there that you recognized your organization is already doing really well? And third, and you can keep it all to yourself, but just know, right? Do you see an opportunity for personal growth in the dynamics, right? How you show up in the dynamics of a group. And if possible, can you name that edge for yourself and just mark it out like, yeah, I want to revisit that with myself at some point. All right, so the next condition of collective impact, that next step is to generate a landscape view through strategic learning. So strategic learning is that condition. At USBC, the way that we have evolved to get at that is to generate a landscape view. So what is it that I mean by that? As I was putting this together, I was thinking about the Quaker Church, where when they have an open meeting, there's the idea that, we're only going to understand the big picture if everyone gives voice to their perspective, and then the theme of the day is revealed. Well, if that lands for you, you can think about this process a little bit that way, like we need to hear from everyone. So it's kind of 2 parts for this for us. First is exploring what is urgent or emergent. right? And you want to kind of take this one first a lot of times, because urgent and emergent lives in our bodies in this really like forward kind of way. So you want to give people an opportunity to speak to that. So you can ask, what are stakeholders doing on this topic, right? Like, what brings you to this call today or this meeting? What do they know that are key develops or updates on this particular topic? You know, if you've been in this kind of call with me, you'll see sometimes I take notes live time, sharing screens if we're working virtually, and I note the person, their organization, whatever it is they're bringing. A lot of times in this process, as we do that, we start to see, oh, there's themes, right? Collectively, we know stuff about what's going on. Then we can also be surfacing, are there new resources that exist, or are there tools that are needed? And also, what concerns does the group have, right? And sometimes, especially in the beginning, it can be, you know, most of the call just to be taking the time to really find out what brings everyone here, right? What's top of mind, what's known, what's urgent. As the group is establishing their norms, they're getting to know each other, they're marking out what's there in the landscape, then it's a time to conduct a root cause analysis. We have a template tool to guide this process that we'll be sharing today. So exploring root causes and impacts is a fundamental equity step. And I've got many examples and stories of how doing that process really shifts the focus of the group and ultimately often what they choose to work on. Because it surfaces what is the underlying impact, intended or not, of the given policy or structure that are out there in the world, impacting people's lives. So we can explore the issues at the roots. So who is most marginalized by the problem? Who is doing well despite the problem? Which institutions and policies impact the problem? And what do we know about the history of the problem to address the present inequities? This is a really important time to be practicing that inner value of decentering yourself, taking in new information, learning about how people in your community or ecosystem might be having a very different experience of a given policy or system than you have. And it can be eye-opening and enlightening. And it's a really important part of the shared learning. So then we get to a point in the process, you know, this might be a few meetings in, depending again, the speed you're able to work, where you want to start to identify high leverage activities. So what do we mean by this? So, you know, often when people think about policy, they think about legislation. Legislation is just one tool. And as we just saw from the 10 years it took to pass the Pump Act, it's not a very efficient tool. So anything that we do together in this vein helps to contribute to the body of knowledge and experience and information that helps to move a thing along, right? So position statements are kind of low-hanging fruit. Like, what is it that we believe and what is our evidence for that from our point of view as the stakeholders at this table? Exploring and changing organizational policies. You know, at the beginning of USBC's equity journey, that was one of the ways we fundamentally changed the structure of the organization while we did the work to also change the culture. You know, city ordinances, that can be a kind of a lower hanging fruit sometimes. You can also be looking for implementation advisory groups, right? We said at the top of this call that passing a law is just the first step. Then you have to implement a thing. Often the implementation is assigned to an advisory body where you can do the research. Who's on that advisory body? How do we get onto that advisory body? How do we influence that? Become one of the people influencing it. Sometimes those advisory bodies or government agencies will open up the opportunity for public comments. Public comments are also an opportunity where collaborative groups can come many different ways to be able to decide, are they going to do comments all together, comments separately but aligned? You know, that's a really good lever. Legislation and law, again, can take a long time potentially, but also is game-changing. And then regulation and again, implementation are other places to look. So then comes the research portion. And I really want to emphasize, although it's not the most fun thing necessarily, it can be a little bit of an adventure and definitely is worthwhile the investment, because a lot of times policy mechanisms are obscure. I often think about a story from a water rights advocate who I know, who one day went to a protest about coal train on the river. And it was hundreds of people spelling out words in the water on kayaks. And he said, you know, it was such an amazing show of support, but unfortunately, the thing they were asking for isn't actually the lever that's going to change the actual real policy, right? So spending the time to really understand how something works, research, what is it that makes what, right? And then learn together how something works, discern together what something means, and then track the responses of the group. Like, oh, when I saw that, it made me think of this. Those actually, that thinking out loud process, that group exploration is very rich fodder for understanding, both like continuing to grow the community of the group, the sense of understanding, how to bridge difference, how we interpret things, but also just the given structure that's here. How does this thing work? And how do we influence it? Spending the time learning about it makes it so that when you get to the point of action, you're going to be a little more clear what it is to do. So throughout this process, while we're listening to our partners and we're being in community, the policy mechanisms are emerging, right? The group understanding is building. And in that process, you want to have an ear out for one another to assess real organizational capacity. Now, I think we've all come to learn through this pandemic, right? Everyone's pretty tired. Organizations are pretty tapped. People have been sick or are now gone. A lot has happened in these years, right? And the actual capacity that individuals and organizations are bringing to these collaborative tables has got to be held with a lot of care. And it's important, especially in an equity-centered initiative, to recognize those most impacted by an issue might have the least capacity to work on it. So when we're building our shared understanding of how all these things work, understanding like, some are going to have more to give one day, and other people need to like inform and receive, but might not be in a position individually or as an organization to be the principal doers. It doesn't mean a lack of interest. Sometimes actually quite the opposite. So let's take another moment, a little reflection. We've gone over 2 additional conditions of collective impact. So one is strategic learning. We talked about the difference between surfacing urgent issues and root causes. I want you to take a moment to notice the difference even in your body as you look at those 2 things. Right? For me, urgent issues, I feel it like coming forward, right? Root causes sits back in my body. Why is that important? Because we need a really different kind of approach, I think, in how we surface and work with those 2 different conversations. So take a moment for yourself. How does that feel for you, the difference? And how might that difference change your approach? So now considering high leverage activities in this research project, right? And the need to be calibrating capacity. So given the limitations and differences in limitations and capacity, how does the search for high leverage activities underscore the importance of research? Let's think for yourself. Why would it be important to really understand a thing before doing a thing? All right, so the next stage and condition of collective impact is community aspiration. Now, in the original literature called this common agenda. I love this shift to community aspiration, right? We want to be selecting the strategies together that reflect, right, that ultimate version of the ultimate vision. What can we really breathe into and be nourished by? So when we lead with our values, which we've been developing, right, a long time with our community, then it informs the selection of those group priorities, right? If we've built inclusive tables, if we recognize trust is present, if we have a shared understanding of the issue we're here to look at because of the learning journey we've been on, we've assessed our capacity, and we've learned to center those most impacted, the priority strategies actually become fairly obvious. They reflect the community aspiration, right? What's the world we want to see? What do we know the families we serve deserve? How do we want it to be for us to be here in this, in the evolving struggle to get there? And again, always, but especially now, we have to pace for sustainability, right? The bigger the lift, the slower the going. Thinking again about the Pump Act that just passed into law. I worked on a state law, 2005, it was passed as a workplace employer description of what we wanted. And 2 years later, we came back and it was then a regulation that had teeth, right? We added the enforcement component. So that was a 2-year shift. On this national level, it took 10 years to get from the place of a description of what was needed to something with a private right of action. Part of that difference in the timing was the scale, I think, that we were working on. So we want to build a strategy that can bring everyone along, right? And we want to have space for each organization to contribute as fits for them. So we've, used our hearts, we've used our heads. When we get to our hands and we start planning, we want to bring a lot of purpose and intentionality to this, right? We want to be identifying the mutually reinforcing activities that fit with each partner's capacity, right? If you have a truly multi-sector coalition, what a government agency is able to do is really different than what a community clinic is able to do, is really different than someone in private practice is able to do. They all have something to do to contribute toward the common aspiration, community aspiration, but it's going to look different for each, and there needs to be room and flexibility to make that fit. And in equity-centered work, there's total support for everyone to get to name what that is for them. And there's trust that that's real. So we can also invite reflections on the impact. So stewards or conveners, whatever you call yourself, wherever you're organizing people and to come together, you can ask the participants, on an annual basis, whatever makes sense. How effective was the learning journey we went on in building a shared understanding of this topic? Does the plan that we make align with your organization, or has anything changed? Are we realizing the shared vision? Or what is the result of our efforts? We tend to, in our culture, I think, skip over celebration a lot. Taking a moment to really say and admire what it is we're building together is fundamental, I think, to being human and also to being nourished to keep on going. So then you also can reflect on the depth of the collaboration, right? So one way of evaluating it is, how is it going with what we're doing? But it's just as important to say, how is it going with the people that are here and that experience, both as individuals and as organizational reps? So the stewards can ask participants, how valuable is this to you and to your organization? How comfortable are you? Again, how comfortable are you voicing a dissenting or unpopular view? How comfortable is your organization, right? And what kind of investments is your organization making? Like, we have to notice at a collaborative table if there are people who are there as volunteers and there's other people who are there in a paid capacity, for example, right? There needs to be ways to acknowledge that, and if anything, like mitigate and balance it as one example of the kind of difference of investments we could be coming with. So this next principle is about a container for change, right? Or what the original literature in the USBC ecosystem calls the backbone, right? We want to provide a framework that serves as a container for change. So our backbone support, that continuous communication, includes this conscious convening of people and stakeholders around given topics, equity-informed facilitation, research, helping the stewards to research whatever the landscape is and the mechanisms of change. At times, some negotiation, mediation kind of steps, and also that regular kind of surveying, checking in with the stakeholders. So as I mentioned at the top, this is our USBC strategic framework, just dressed in our pretty new colors, but the same one that you've known for the last 10 years. And soon, USBC will be embarking on a process of updating the strategic framework for the next 10-year vision. I think most of you are probably also familiar with the constellation formation pathway. You know, we've probably emphasized this a little more than we needed to, but what we've tried to do in this logic model is to mark out the different stages of development that a group will go through and what kinds of considerations to be looking for or working on at each stage of development as you formalize yourself as an identity of a group, or at USBC as a constellation. So to review, right, the key components of collective impact, version 3.0 for Tamarack Institute, presented USBC style, right? We're looking for a leadership paradigm that really distributes leadership, right? Where we can focus on leaderful movement building. What I mean by that is everyone that's here belongs and has something important and valuable to contribute. The 5 conditions are inclusive community engagement, right? How we bring people together is as important as what we do. Strategic learning, looking at the landscape and the root causes, right? High leverage activities. So what is it we could do that would really make a difference in the thing? What's, you know, like we think it's this law, but actually it's run by this advisory group, which is actually formed by this body. Who takes that person out to lunch? Which is a little bit of a joke, but, you know, truly sometimes you keep on following a thing and one strategic conversation can change things downstream. Looking at the community aspiration and supporting it all with backbone organizations that are serving as a container for change. So taking another pause for reflections. So related to community aspiration. So I want to make some connections here. In what way is community trust essential to discovering and realizing community aspiration? And then related to containers for change, we can just notice that minimalist structures still hold water. This doesn't have to be complex. It doesn't have to, you know, be called collective impact, but it's still valuable to understand the way that these things interconnect and grow upon each other in order to have really effective ways of moving those larger contexts where we all live and move and breathe and pray and play. So shifting gears a little bit, let's look at the United States policy landscape. So like what's here and what have we marked out together that we want to work on? So in light of the infant nutrition, in light of the infant formula crisis, right, the USBC, along with our leadership and our membership and the larger field, went through a very expansive process that took us to this place of articulating what we've been calling the 4 pillars of infant nutrition security. We've been playing with this for a while, living, moving, breathing with it for months. And what we really like about it is anything we test falls into one of these buckets. So there's a home for all of the collaborative work and all of the what we think might still emerge. So let's talk about each of these briefly. So in the parents pillar, this is including everyone who loves and cares for a child. Right? People of all races, genders, caregiving roles, routes to parenthood, immigration status, religious or political views, and all infant feeding methods. If you love and care for a child, you belong. Right? And this is, I think that crisis, as well as all the environmental issues and the different disasters and the pandemic that have been coming, has shown us, right? We need to be including everyone who loves and cares for a child in this conversation about infant nutrition security. Everyone is a stakeholder in that. When we talk about the programs pillar, we're talking about federal programmatic funding, recognizing that this work that's happening, national, state, and community level, right, is largely supported through federal programmatic funding mechanisms. So you can see all these agencies here, CDC, HRSA, National Institutes of Health, right? They all have a part in this. And in particular, CDC does many of the programs that affect us and touch us right in states and communities where we live. Maternity care practices, physician education, lactation support, capacity building assistance, emergency response, workplace support, and national monitoring and reporting, which again is important because why? Because breastfeeding initiation and duration rates are an indication of overall community health and resource. The policies pillar puts forward policies that are going to help. It's pretty exciting updating this particular slide, recognizing, hey, the PUMP Act and the Pregnant Workers Fairness Act both just passed, right? We had them ready, the need was shown, and this was their moment. We still have a lot of work to do though, right? Lots of opportunities, including national paid family leave, looking at an infrastructure of nonprofit donor milk banks, the integration of IYCFE or infant young child feeding and emergency practices at every level of the system so that we're much more resilient and responsive, and regulation of the commercial milk formula industry marketing practices. We know that the way the marketing of infant formula works is predatory, and it's not okay. So formula has a place in infant nutrition security, and so does the regulation of those marketing practices. So the fourth pillar is the plan pillar. So this is a plan for IYCFE, which every nation needs and which our country really doesn't have yet, right? So we've learned from Dr. Anjali Palmquist that emergencies really include, like that planning is really 3 different components. So emergency preparedness includes things like building a directory of lactation support providers in every community, right? And a tracking system for resources such as formula. Emergency response, right, includes trauma-informed care, right? Have we prepared to be ready to be delivering care in a way that recognizes different people are experiencing this in different ways, right? Families with infants and young children are particularly vulnerable and have a different set of needs than others that are coming into the shelter, for example, right? And we need access to supplies within that shelter that meets the specifications of not being branded, right? And promoting a particular brand of formula, for example. We need access to water. We need the ability to clean pump parts or other supplies. The third component of that is emergency resilience. And we often go from the response and then we forget we're supposed to be investing in our resilience. So I love knowing about this. The same thing is like, oh, let's remember to celebrate, right? Let's remember to really look at the resilience. So that includes centering the needs of the communities that were disproportionately impacted by the disaster. Like, hey, the water levels have receded. but how are you? So we've just announced, most of you have received the USBC policy priorities for the coming 118th congressional session. They are federal funding for breastfeeding, for the reasons we just talked about, infant nutrition security, right, which is this container that can hold what emerges, and access to lactation support and supplies, workplace protections, which is not yet done, even though the Pump Act has passed, and maternity care practices. So even the selection at USBC is done in a collaborative way, right? We really hear you. So we have a two-part process. First, we go really broad with stakeholder survey to generate the topics, right? We don't ever want to assume that we have the view or know what is what. So we ask the question, what is important? And a benefit of membership at USBC is that members get to vote on selecting what those priority strategies are. Why is that important? It helps us as staff at USBC, who are serving as the containers for these change, to know where the membership would like to see us putting our capacity, which is also limited, and our resources, so that we're really focusing on the things that you've marked out as most important. And it helps us, just all be able to work together. So we have tools, and we'll continue to develop more tools for education and outreach, both for you as a stakeholder audience, and then also for you to take to others that you are educating about this broader landscape. So we're very excited that coming quite soon are the 2023 state and territorial breastfeeding reports. Major kudos to those on the USBC staff who directly touch this and those who support them in this mighty effort. We're so thrilled. The 2023 breastfeeding reports are a whole new, really juicy new level of detail from reports that we've put in the past. Every state will have their own. It gives data on breastfeeding rates and support indicators. It lists the coalitions serving in each state and territory, and also the federal funded projects within that given state. And this can be really important for those who are either asking for or choosing about federal funding, to understand where is that going and what kind of impact is that making in states and territories. So some other tools of consideration. At USBC, we have both coalition and member directories to help you find each other. We have this new First Food Connection Hub. We hope that you've established a profile there, and that you also start playing in that profile so you can find one another, have conversations, share resources, be in collaborative groups together in collaborative conversations that are not limited to the geography of your locale, but can really be, as a national coalition of coalitions. We also have a set of tools that we have created for Constellation stewards of those, leading collaborative groups at USBC. But any of our members, we'd be happy to share these tools with you for the work you're doing in your states and communities. So I mentioned before, we have a root cause analysis template, right? We also have a terms of reference template. What that means is where you start to write down the group agreements about how to function. It doesn't have to be complicated, but having a template can kind of help everyone see what the considerations might be. And then we also have a Constellation pathway record template. And again, it guides everything from the landscape view, the route analysis, the selection of those priority strategies. So it sort of serves as a guide about how would you walk through this process. So taking another moment for reflection. When you consider the USBC policy priorities for the coming session, what comes up for you as an area of excitement or alignment with your organization? And when you consider the USBC tools, was there anything there that you weren't aware of or you hadn't really dug into? What are you most eager to use next in your collaborative work? So we want to give some examples of this shared aspiration, right, for creating policy change. So we have this model, right? We have all these words about it. And what is it leading to in our ecosystem? I mean, our collective ecosystem that many of you are part of. So we have some constellations that are active. So workplace support and paid leave, we're having a big celebration here. But there's so much that went into that moment of that recent victory, right? So I mentioned publications are an opportunity for collaborative group to state what it is that they know and how it is that they know it. So some examples from the workplace support and paid leave constellation include the publication of creating a culture to support breastfeeding physicians and medical trainees. And that was actually an example of collaborating with the physician education and training constellation to come together to publish that. This constellation has also published resources for parents. They've led various webinar series, and then they've worked on legislation. So as Cheryl has said, there'll be other presentations that go all into what happened, but just to make sure that we're clear, right? Ultimately, whatever scale you're working with, when you talk about legislation, it's having an idea about something you really care about, and then having conversations with people who are in a position to do something about it. That's kind of all advocacy is, right? One conversation after another. Now, how you structure that conversation, what you bring to the table of those conversations changes with the complexity of the field or the topic, right? Or the stakeholder group. But broad brush, right? You have an idea, you build whatever kind of table of experts. Now, remember at USBC, we say that's both context and content experts. Everyone's an expert. Your lived experience is value and helpful, right? Can develop the bill text and you test it while building support. And again, you want to be listening not only for the people who love it, right, but the people who see, have a problem with it or want something or need something changed about it in order to be able to have buy-in. So, if you're persistent and you don't give up until the thing is done and you continue to build, that idea, right, can become a law. So again, just quickly about the US legislative process, right? The Senate and House both receive the text, committees meet about it, right? It has to pass on both sides, they conference, right? And then both sides are voting. And then ultimately, if you are very skilled and fortunate, the president will then sign your idea into law. Okay, the lactation support provider constellation is one of the few that has been fortunate to be able to meet in person, right? What are the levers for change? Examples for the levers of change from this group include building a beloved community, right? And I just want to name how transformational that is. We can't take it for granted, particularly in a space that started out with pretty radical difference. And we all had to level up the skill of how to navigate those differences to find, right, the community aspiration. Once we had our agreements about how to function, then we were really able to move, right? So the group has since published the lactation support provider descriptor chart, lactation support provider training directory, and recently published payer policy guidance related to insurance coverage and some innovative ideas about how existing structures might be used to increase access to care. The group has also submitted public comments, both to the Women's Preventive Services Initiative and to the TRICARE demonstration project. Now that TRICARE demonstration project is another great example, right, of how a work is not yet done. So we submitted public comments. We did not we get the kind of the influencer response that we wanted, so we'll keep working at it. The point is to be in a conversation with one another and be looking for what are those high leverage activities that can begin to build a sense of influence in whoever, with whomever you're trying to educate. Okay, next is our pasteurized donor human milk constellation. So some of the levers for change that they have engaged in, they published a statement related to pasteurized donor human milk and COVID-19. They're working on legislation for the Donor Milk Safety Act. And right now, there's an organizational sign-on letter that you can sign and be part of if you haven't yet. These are 3 different mechanisms. The point here is less a report about what the constellations have done or are doing, and more to demonstrate that wherever you are working, there's a lot of different ways to kind of fit the right size activity into your group and whatever that group's capacity is. Okay, the Physician Education and Training Constellation has shared several different publications. That culture plan I mentioned, they did with the Workplace Support Constellation. They've created culture plan infographics to go with it. They have a training curriculum, and they published the physician's role in breastfeeding support. So their main mechanism so far has been working on publications and training, so getting the word out. And then the infant and young child feeding in emergencies. This is the fastest forming group. It came together during COVID-19, and we believe has a life cycle, a destiny yet to fulfill, with creating some of that infant and young child feeding infrastructure that we know the United States needs. So some of the levers for change this group has engaged in: a story collector, right, where we really captured the lived experiences of both providers and families, right? And then we used that in really courageous conversations with policymakers. We also published a statement on IYCFE in the context of COVID, and then updated it in the context of the infant formula shortage last spring. So a variety of different mechanisms arising from one group, right? Work still to do, but a lot of different ways to get where they need to go. So then we have some constellations that are emerging, right? So you've heard us talk about having incubating conversations. So what we mean by that is like, well, let's just explore this topic. Who's interested? Is there something important to do right now? Is there the capacity to work on it, or we have a steward with it? So 2 of those topics, one is disrupting formula marketing, right? So even though it's not a formed constellation, we've had some incubation conversations to see what's possible. And we've also engaged in a webinar series to support the shared learning journey. So it's not an established group, it's not formalized, but they're still like there. And it will progress when all the conditions are right. Similarly, maternity care practices, it's not a formed constellation, but we've had moments of bringing stakeholders together to have a group discernment. That in and of itself is a step, right? In this case, CMS had proposed policy, and they opened a public comment period about it. And so we brought stakeholders together to see, like, what are we making of this? What does it mean? And then, supported one another in submitting comments, however that was appropriate. And then we have a constellation, or a topic that's currently resting, and that's the continuity of care constellation. Last year, they published the continuity of care for breastfeeding support, a blueprint for communities. And we would love to see, that work continue, given how important that topic is. So, given what you've heard about USBC's collective impact approach, curious, how is this similar or different to what you're doing in community? How is it similar? And in particular, what do you notice is different? Think for a moment about your organization. I'm curious, what could be gained by working with USBC member organizations? If you're not a member yet, you could become. And if you are a member and you're not yet plugged into this group, or you have an idea for the group, you can play in the First Food Connection Hub and or raise that to us. And in what ways has your view of policy and legislation changed or expanded from this presentation? Hopefully you heard something new. So I want to invite, a discussion. I think that we've got a few Q&A. So how about Cheryl, I'm going to go ahead and close my screen. And if you want to come back onto camera and, we can have a conversation, answer questions with folks. You can use the Q&A and the host panelist chat. Q&A, I think, makes it a little easier.
Yes, thank you so much, everybody. I'm just going to share my screen once again. We do have just a couple of questions. We got many questions about the Pump Act, so I'm going to invite Camille to please share the link to the Pump Act webpage on the chat so that you all can see that. It does have some information about this new exciting law. You can also expect to see additional resources coming out truly in the next couple of days. So there will be an explainer document, which includes, input from all of the coalition partners, including our attorney friends who have been able to really take the time to interpret the ins and outs of what this means for families. You're going to see that on the webpage. You'll also see it in the Weekly Wire. If you're not already getting the Weekly Wire, we can pop that subscription form right for you there. We also had several questions about the state breastfeeding reports. So those are very exciting. There is a webpage where you can find the previous version of the report from 2021. The 2023 version, it will look very different. It's much more beautiful. And those will be coming out later this month. So do stay tuned for that. Again, in the Weekly Wire, you will receive emails. It'll be all over the webpage. We're very excited about that resource. Wanted to bring up a couple of questions. We do need to leave some room for some updates at the end, but so we'll do our best. Amelia, we have a question asking about in terms of inclusion, diversity, belonging, and a community collaborative, how do you encourage and handle Latino participation when information, data, and meetings are in English?
Yeah, I really appreciate this question. This is a place at USBC that we are very aware is not only a working edge for us, but one where we have not yet developed the resources, although we very much want to. I think that what does feel imperative is that we never place a burden on anyone, like, to become a translator for the group just because they have the capacity of being bilingual or multilingual, and recognizing that an assumption on our part placing that burden, we want to get to the place where we build the capacity to be able to offer as infrastructure that is funded and supported, rather than doing something halfway. I don't know how it works potentially in communities where maybe there's a partner organization that can bring in maybe their contribution into the collaborative can be some of that translation, but it's very difficult. It's a real problem. I think the only other thing that comes up for whatever this is worth is making sure that we remember, especially when we're together in a space, that we can have that heart connection, right? There's a lot of different ways to demonstrate welcome. There's a lot of different ways to demonstrate cultural compassion, including providing food, providing childcare, meeting somewhere in public transportation, right? But those translation services that's really difficult for us. I don't think that's a very satisfying answer, but it's an honest one.
Thank you so much. We have a question asking for you to share just a little bit more about implementation advisory groups. The gap that's been observed in this person's state is that legislation is passed, but no education goes with it.
Yeah, so, the example I know most closely is being on an advisory group in Oregon when we passed the state workplace protection law. So the advisory group, I brought together a whole lot of people to then help the Department of Labor to administer the law. Now, there's a process related to what is the function of that advisory group, what's their stated charter or purpose, and how do people get into that table, right? And how are they supported, and what happens from there? So one of the things I think we've learned is that when you are working to pass a policy, working to pass legislation, you want to think ahead as much as possible about that implementation piece, right? Because ultimately interpretation is sort of everything. So there's most, laws will stipulate like, where does this live in statute or who is responsible? So as much as there can be proactive communication with that party to say, how are you going to implement this? How can we support that? What is it that you need? How can we provide education? And then outward, what are you going to do to then educate, right, the larger community about this law, about the regulations, about how the whole thing functions? So some of it is, if it doesn't exist, start to do that research we talked about on how would you go about creating that if it's not there. If it is there, how do you go about influencing that?
Thank you so much. We just have a couple more questions. We have a question about where to find Constellation resources. So we do have a webpage on the USBC website that we can share in the chat, which brings together various collaborative documents that the constellations have formed. We also have one final question that we'll answer live before we move into reflections and USBC updates. And this viewer wrote, our org is in a less powerful position in the state. It's been difficult to instigate collaboration, but some efforts are starting to succeed. We still feel at the mercy of the largesse and interest of other state orgs and individuals. We're still finding our feet as to our own capacity. What advice or ideas do you have as we try to keep making inroads?
I love this question. Right. So one of the tools I believe we still have is something called the Top 100 Partners. And it's, we could find that if we don't have it at our fingertips right now, but it's helpful and in thinking outside of the box, right, about who you're partnering with, especially if you want to go multi-sectoral, which is recommended, right? Like, don't just keep having conversations with the same group. So often in breastfeeding, that can mean think about the larger public health. Right? I think in some communities, it includes things like water safety and access, right? It includes the groups that are working on emergency and disaster response. It can be very unusual partners, right? And so sometimes if you feel like kind of pigeonholed, siloed, diminished in your reach, really start to think differently about where are there connections that might not have been identified or established yet. And then how do you go about, again, like just building those relationships? Again, no matter what scale we're working on, it all starts with that inner work, that interpersonal connection to then start to build something. So hopefully, that sense that you're having that you don't have the kind of like the power or the heft you want your group, change maybe how you define group.
Thank you so much, Amelia. This was a really special and important webinar. I've really been very grateful to have the opportunity to work with Amelia for about a decade now. And I feel like the beauty of what this presentation really brought was understanding how the work that we do to really make room for collaboration and bring diverse stakeholders together, and how the nurturing of those relationships between and across sectors, from federal agencies to local organizations, and how investing time and effort in that, and bringing folks together is really in service of these really lofty, big, ambitious goals that we have to shape policy systems and environments that surround families. It is long, slow work. It can be a real slog. It can be really up and down. We talk a lot about hurry up and wait. You're scrambling to do a thing because maybe there's an opportunity, and sometimes those opportunities don't pan out, but we keep showing up. We keep working to identify what's the most important message, who's the most important messenger, who needs to hear what and when, and how all of these pieces come together and ultimately can really help us recreate the landscape that babies and parents are subject to, so that one day it's fully normal. They aren't facing barriers that where you live or your race, your immigration status, where you work, how old you are has no impact on the likelihood of breastfeeding success, which is really the change that we're trying to achieve here. So thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
We do want to take a moment to share about some upcoming opportunities as we wrap up our Q&A session. If you do have additional questions, always you can reach us at office at usbreastfeeding.org. You'll hear from Erin on our staff team, who does a wonderful job connecting folks to whoever the most appropriate staff person is. So we want to start out by just thanking you all for coming and participating in this session, and thanking Amelia for sharing just a wealth of wisdom, lessons learned, some the hard way, through many, many years with this field. So first, we're going to dive into a couple of updates before we all release. So first, in conjunction with today's webinar, the USBC are going to be hosting our next peer learning opportunity. So this is for our membership and affiliated coalition network. And these are going to take place on January 23rd and January 27th, respectively. So please come ready to share about the policy systems and environmental change work that your organization is involved in, and the collaborative efforts you are leading or contributing to advance this work. Registration for these peer learning opportunities will open later this week, so please be on the lookout for an invitation in your inbox. Today's webinar support team has shared the links to our member and coalition directories. Please feel free to look at those to confirm whether an organization you're a part of is listed. You can also use our member affiliate link to make sure you get connected in our database for future opportunities. And if your organization is not currently a member of the USBC, you can change that today. So you can please fill out the membership interest form. We'll pop it into the chat now, and the membership team will follow up with you. Membership really can be a powerful influence, and it can be a lot less expensive than you might think. We'll also want to invite everybody to please save the date for the 2023 National Breastfeeding Conference and Convening. This is going to be hosted in person from June 8th through 10th in Bethesda, Maryland. So that's right, we're finally going to all be back in person. This year's theme is expanding connections and partnering for progress. And this really speaks to the importance of developing relationships and aligning efforts within and beyond the lactation community to amplify our impact and unlock solutions for a better tomorrow for mothers and lactating parents. If you or your organization have the expertise or practical experience related to this year's learning goals, please do submit the 2023 NBCC Plenary Speaker Interest Form by Monday, January 16th. So it's this Monday. And just note that all speakers will be paid an honorarium. We are also very excited to announce the launch of our Equity Champions Directory. This new free resource has been made possible through funding from the W.K. Kellogg Foundation, and it was created to help individuals and organizations in our network to find support in operationalizing diversity, equity, and inclusion within their internal structures, policies, and programs. So if your organization is committed to taking that next step in its equity journey, we encourage you to visit the directory. And if you have experience helping people and organizations operationalize diversity, equity, and inclusion, please do share your experience using the link that you'll see in the chat in just a moment. And finally, we want to extend a heartfelt thank you to our donors. Donations are critical for our work, and they are the sole source of support for our advocacy efforts. So if you'd like to donate to the USBC, please, we will pop the link into the chat, and thank you in advance for your generosity. None of this would be possible without our donors. Finally, we want to welcome you all to complete the satisfaction survey for today's presentation. So you can find the link to the survey in the chat box again in just a moment. If you selected continuing education as part of your registration, you must complete the satisfaction survey and make your request within the form by Friday, January 20th. So it's very important. Again, I'm going to say it just one more time. If you want to receive continuing education for your participation in today's webinar, please make sure that you complete the satisfaction survey, make your selection that you are seeking continuing education before, and complete that form by January 20th. So that's next Friday. Certificates will be sent out by Friday, February 10th. And that brings us to the end of today's session. I'm just going to pause and see if any other team members have additional updates they'd like to share in our few moments. In particular, I know there were several membership questions, so we'll just see if anyone would like. Danae, is there anything you want to share? Or
Hi, sure, I can come off mute. I see there are a couple questions about how to join the USBC membership network. The best way to do that is to fill out the membership interest form. And the most important thing to note is that membership is open to organizations. So we are a coalition of coalitions. And so if your organization is not listed in our membership directory, we would love to have you join the table. So you can fill that interest form out. You can also schedule a time with me at any point by sending me an email and letting me know that you'd like to chat about what membership could mean for your organization. I think that was all around membership. And I think that's all. Yeah.
Amelia, do you have any other closing thoughts before we go? We have a very unique problem in that we're actually a few minutes early, and I've really enjoyed this session and want to invite you for any closing thoughts.
I think one of the things that I've been reflecting on a lot is, when I guess a few different pieces of one thread. When we started on our collective impact journey, the invitation from the Kellogg Foundation was to see, could we take these principles and scale them for national application, because that really hadn't been done. But also, could we at the same time imbue and embed racial equity commitment into every part of that? Well, that necessitated that we also transform both the structure and the culture of the organization so that we were actually equipped to do that work and to be that body. Right? I want to emphasize it's both. It's always the structure and it's the culture. And I think that's why we, both maybe belabor, but really emphasize that how we bring people to the table is as important as what it is that we do. And it's also why I mark out as an accomplishment, right? As a mechanism for change, building beloved community is itself a mechanism for transformation. Because until you have that place of trust, you can't actually engage in work, because the work you're still doing is the struggle of my view, your view, my identity, your identity, right? There's got to be like, what We don't have to agree, we don't have to be the same, but we need to find enough understanding of a community aspiration that we've got something that can really nourish us and be worth investing in. And, that journey, that arc was rough and rocky for USBC, the people, the structure, the organization, right? There was a lot to do. But for me, the litmus test of this whole model and our approach happened with the pandemic, when a lot of organizations were transitioning to virtual work, and we'd already been doing virtual work. So we had that part ready to go. A lot of organizations were trying to figure out this is a very big problem. How do we work collectively towards a big problem? We already knew how to do that. So, and had been doing it for years, right? So I think within a few days, right, or maybe a week, we were able to have the COVID-19 infant and young child feeding in emergencies constellation, right? Where some constellations are still not formed. That one formed in days and had 42 organizations join. And we were able to do things together. All those steps we just talked about, strategically bringing in different voices, listening to and centering those most impacted, identifying and contacting the policy and decision makers, working together to influence heartfully what was happening, right? And the unintended consequences of the policies that were governing maternity care practices at that moment. It was a disastrous moment, right? So for me, there was, as hard as that time was, as painful as it was incredible to get to see, wow, we built something that is now being tested in this pretty ultimate way. And we're here and we're doing it. And I think that group was ultimately able to be part of those governing policies changing for hospitals, right? Which I think it's not overstating to suggest we're talking about kind of saving a generation, right? When you've got mass separation, you're talking about attachment disorder, right? And we were talking about a context where people were not only being separated from their newborns, but then sent home into communities where they couldn't even receive a casserole, right? Let alone lactation support if they had bandwidth issues or the provider had bandwidth issues. I mean, it was a major, major breakdown. So, well, the ethos of this webinar, we've really tried to emphasize, this isn't rocket science. This is what you're already doing, probably. Identifying some of these principles might just help serve, like the fortification. And at the same time, I think we've really got something here that's pretty sturdy and has a lot of utility. So I hope that's helpful for like some context about why is it important to us to continue to bring and name these conditions.
We have a reflection from one of our participants saying it all starts with an idea, the conversations, and then networking. And they're very eager to learn more about levers to change. And I think that's just really, truly lovely. And also is a perfect segue in thinking about really what are our next steps. So we've today celebrated some achievements. We've talked about how do we reach our goals. And one of the steps that you even heard about was our policy priorities moving forward for this session. So one of the really important roles that this field can play is actually educating policymakers on why policy systems and environmental change matters for lactation. This is not about individual choice. This is about access. And so one of the really important roles that we all have is really making sure that our legislators understand that we need their leadership and it is absolutely necessary for policymakers to create changes because there are too many policies on the books that do not take into account what it means to reproduce and to be a human being in the context of your life, in community settings and employment settings, in healthcare settings. So that's a big part of what we will be doing with our Welcome Congress campaign. This is really truly about educating lawmakers about that role, about the areas where we're seeing a lot of gaps and where the field has come together to identify where action can be taken. It is not lobbying to educate policymakers. It is not lobbying to respond to public comment opportunities. That's a really important engagement that we have access to as a part of a democracy. So we really encourage folks to do their part and to take action where there are opportunities and to really share your wisdom because you have a perspective that no one else has. So please do stay tuned for updates about that. You should be seeing all kinds of invitations for our sign-on letter, for our state breastfeeding reports, which will be available for download very soon. We invite always feedback and input. We are perpetually learning and growing and trying to do better than we've ever done in the past. And we remain committed to that learning stance. So thank you very much. With that, we're going to come to the end of today's session. I just want to, again, thank you all for participating. I can see there were dozens and dozens of questions and comments that have helped us move through this conversation, and that's really exciting to see. And just want to thank you all for your support for families, because we know that it takes all sectors. Anything that impacts the lived experience of families, you know, makes a difference. So we all play our role. We all bring our specific gifts to this work. So thank you for doing that and for sharing your knowledge with us. So be on the lookout for a follow-up email. There will be different resources. There will also be a recording, which will be available within the week. And stay tuned for additional sessions. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.